Okay, gonna have a good video today, that's the plan. So when you're learning how to knit, there are questions that come up. And actually, even when you're an experienced knitter, there are questions that come up, or there are questions you didn't even know you needed to ask. Well, today I'm going to answer at least some of these, and if by the end you still have questions, please let me know down in the comments below, because really, don't we always have questions? So hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, give this video a thumbs up, and let's answer some common knitting questions. As we get started, as always, a quick reminder that down in the description box, you will find timestamps to different parts of the video. I always hope that you'll watch through at least one time, because you never know what little bit of information you might discover, or a funny little moment, maybe a burp. I've been known to burp on camera. Anyway, point being, you never know what you might find, but sometimes you need to get to something specific, so there are timestamps below. Also down below, you will find a list of materials and resources that I think are helpful for today's video. Some of these will have clearly marked affiliate links. If you click on one of my affiliate links, it'll take you to a place to do some shopping. And if you make a purchase, I might earn a small commission. These commissions really do help support my channel and, keep me going in my mission to spread the joy and love of making pretty things, oftentimes with pretty string. Do you count your cast on row as row 1? I will admit that this first question is one that I didn't know the answer to for too long, an embarrassingly long time, and really only got the answer because I went through the Master Hand Knitters course, level 1. Didn't finish it, long story. If you want to know about it, let me know down in the comments below. I could probably do a video about that. But anyway, the short answer is no, your cast on row does not count unless a pattern states otherwise. Short answer, okay? Really simple, and that is the rule of thumb. Why is that though? There's really two reasons why generally you don't count your cast on row as row 1. One is not all cast-ons actually produce a knitted edge. Some cast-ons do. Knitted on cast-on, long tail cast-on. When you're done, you actually have a row of knitting. But there are several cast-ons, like backwards loop cast-on or easy loop cast-on, that doesn't produce knitted stitches after you're done. It's just loops on your needle. So it's not till row 1 that you actually have your first row of knitting. And patterns generally will not tell you what cast on to utilize. It leaves that decision up to you, the knitter, what cast on you prefer to use. But also let's think about how most patterns are written. Most of them are written where it's like cast on X number of stitches. So cast on 80 stitches. Right? Then it says row 1 knit. There you go. Your row 1 is your knitting, or maybe it's row 1 purl. Regardless of what the direction is, that first row is telling you what to do to produce that first set of knit stitches in the pattern. And so that is your row 1. It's really actually, when you think about it, it makes a lot of logical sense. Now, of course, there are exceptions. There are patterns that will be written where it tells you to count your cast on row as the first row. And when that's the case, you want to make a note of that and make sure that you include it in your count. But unless your directions are specifying that, you should not count your cast on row as a row. So here we have a swatch, right? And we can see, okay, I wouldn't count my first row of knitting as a cast on row, but what about these stitches up here? Well, in this case on my cable, do these loops of yarn on my needle count as a row if I'm counting my rows? And the short answer to that is yes, always, and there's really no exceptions to that. Now, what if you're somebody, you're like, Carrie, I've always counted my work where I counted the cast on row, but I didn't count my stitches up here, and I always got the correct count. So is that a problem? You can get an accurate row count counting the cast on row and not counting the stitches up on your needle. However, when it comes to your reading your work, being able to look at your work and know where you are in a pattern and what's going on, that method of counting your cast on row and not counting the stitches on your needle can lead you astray. If you're trying to figure out where, example, you did a decrease row.
If you were to count up from your cast on row, the number of rows between the cast on and where your decrease is, you would come to a spot where your stitches would come together like this. And you'd think, oh, that's my decrease row.
You'd actually not be correct. It's the row above where you actually did the decrease. I have a whole video about this if you want to check it out and get a deeper dive into it. I personally think that the simplest thing to do is to just follow the rule of thumb of don't count your cast on row, count the stitches up on your needle,
and you won't be led astray.
Very common, new knitter working stockinette for the first time, and they kind of get a little panicky. I certainly did when the fabric starts to curl. I remember being the new knitter working stockinette the first time, and my fabric started to curl, and I was like, oh my gosh, what am I doing wrong? I must be doing something wrong. And it turns out I wasn't doing anything wrong. The problem was not me, the problem was the fabric. So why does stockinette stitch curl? Well, it has to do with the actual shape of the knit stitch itself, and that is a knit stitch is rectangular. And the discrepancy in the size of the stitch between its width and its length causes the fabric to curl if there is not a balance of purl stitches on either side of the fabric. What does that mean? Okay, notice this work here. This swatch, I used a seed stitch border along the edge. A seed stitch has an equal number of purl bumps on both sides of the fabric, which means that the tension between those purl bumps and those legs is evened out and it remains flat. Garter stitch doesn't curl because there's an equal number of purl bumps on each side, and it actually creates a square shape. So it is just knitting physics that stockinette fabric or stitch patterns based in stockinette are going to want to curl. So what do we do about it? Well, there's a couple of things that are done to try to control the curl. One is to have borders. This pattern, you'll notice it's not curling. Part of the reason it's not curling is because I added this seed stitch border all around it, and that helps control the curl of the fabric. Now, mind you, you need quite a bit of border around the fabric to control the curl. Here I have this little swatch, and you'll notice I have a border. I have a garter stitch border all around it, right? And it's laying pretty flat, but it's still wanting to curl, and that's because I just don't have enough garter stitch here at the bottom and the top of the fabric to completely control the curl. Now, it is possible sometimes, depending on the fabric and the fiber involved, to actually pin block the curl out. I swear it is true. There's this kind of design swatch that I made where I was testing out different stitch patterns with this yarn, and you'll notice I got this whole stockinette section in here, and it's not curling on the sides. It's a little wrinkled because it's been folded up for a while. It's a little wrinkled. This is linen and it's a little wrinkled, but anyway. The reason this isn't curled is because when I went to block this, I pin blocked it out, and by pin blocking it, I was able to stretch the stitches out in such a way that I was able to eliminate the curling. So natural fibers like cotton, linen, wool, these I have very successfully pin blocked to remove any curling from the fabric. The downside of doing that type of pin block is it does stretch the fabric, and so it can flatten stitches. So if you're working a stitch pattern like, say, cables, and you're kind of stretching out the fabric, it can kind of flatten your cables. And that's just something you have to decide whether you want to do that or not with the work. When it comes to acrylic, I have never successfully been able to pin block out the curl. I don't know what it is about acrylic. I do know what it is about acrylic. Acrylic just doesn't have as much latitude in blocking as natural fibers do because acrylic doesn't really absorb water. It's hydrophobic. And so acrylic just doesn't block the same way as cotton does or wool does. And I have never been able to block curl out of acrylic. But with all that said, curling happens. It's not you, it is the fabric. It's a simple matter of knit physics, and it's something that if we're gonna work in stockinette flat, we're gonna have to deal with. It's very common in knitting, for various reasons, to see a direction like slip your knit. You see it all the time if you're doing a slip stitch pattern. You might see it if you're doing what's called a slip stitch selvage. And you will definitely see it when you are doing some type of left leaning decrease. Usually that will be a slip stitch, knit the next stitch, then pass the slip stitch over, or the SSK, which is slip, slip, knit. All right. But what those directions oftentimes doesn't clarify is, do you slip your stitches purlwise or knitwise? And the answer is, it depends. I personally remember a very simple mantra: knit now, purl later. Well, let me explain what that means. So if you slip your stitch and then you do something immediately within that row with the stitch, usually it's going to be passing the slip stitch over another stitch or doing something like the SSK. Then you slip as if to knit. What that slipping as if to knit does is it turns the stitch on the needle.
So when you knit the next stitch and then
pass the slip stitch over, the stitch stays untwisted. That's the goal of it. Let's say I'm here and I have a direction to do an SSK. To avoid twisting my stitches, I'm going to slip as if to knit, slip as if to knit, and then those two stitches I just slipped, I then knit two together, and I get a left leaning decrease with no twisted stitch, okay?
if you want a more in-depth look at doing left-leaning decreases like the SSK and the SKPO, I do have a video on that I will link in the description box.
But what if you are slipping a stitch for, say, a slip stitch pattern? Well, that's when purl later comes in.
In slip stitch patterns, you are going to slip stitches and then work them on a following row. In those instances, I'm going to slip as if to purl.
So I turn my work around and you can see those two slip stitches. And if you look closely, those two stitches are sitting on the needle in the same direction of all the other stitches. So when you are slipping a stitch that's not going to be worked until the next row, you slip as if to purl. If you're slipping a stitch that you're going to be doing something with immediately within that row, like passing that slip stitch over or doing the SSK, you slip as if to knit. And that's why I say slip now, purl later when you're slipping stitches.
I misspoke. I say knit now, purl later.
So when I first started learning how to knit, I learned mostly from books, and some of them were quite old. And a lot of those books had this piece of advice, which was for every pattern you knit, go ahead and add a stitch at the beginning and the end so that you can create what's called a slip stitch selvage. The reason for this advice was, one, had to do with the fact that the slip stitch selvage is rather attractive. I have this swatch here that I made quite a while ago. So if you look at that edge, you can see that's very nice, clean chain of stitches along the edge of it, right? If I don't do something like that, you get an edge that looks like this. See this edge? This edge has all these little knots on the end. Not quite as attractive. Why does that happen? Well, it has to do with the nature of knitting, and if you knit the first and last stitch of every row, the stitch kind of doubles back on itself, and so you get the little knot, and the way to avoid that little knot is to do something like a slip stitch selvage. However, that wasn't the reason generally it was given to do the slip stitch selvage. It was actually usually given because I was told in these various resources that doing a slip stitch selvage would help control the curl that happens in stockinette fabric. This was bullshit, by the way. As you can see here on this swatch where I did do a slip stitch selvage, the curl is still there. It did not control the curl whatsoever. I personally reserve that technique for when I'm working a project that has a raw vertical edge, meaning I knit and there's no border on either side of it, because it does give a nice clean edge to the work, okay? But I do not use slip stitch selvages when I'm working a pattern where I'm going to be picking up stitches along the edge, or I'm going to be seaming along the edge. A slip stitch selvage, basically you slip the first and last stitch of every other row. So you slip the stitch of row 1, knit across, then row 2, you slip the stitch and knit across. That means that those column of stitches that are on the vertical edge of knitting, when you use a slip stitch selvage, only has half the stitches of all the other columns of the fabric. And that doesn't necessarily matter if you have a raw vertical edge, okay? But if you're picking up stitches, especially if you're having to pick up stitches in sort of like, you know, pick up 3 stitches, skip a stitch, pick up 3 more stitches, or if you're doing seams, you're going to have fewer places that you're going to be able to pick up a stitch or seam into. And that gives you less flexibility in your work, and it also leads more potential to having gaps when you do pick up stitches or when you seam vertical edges together. So a slip stitch selvage can be a lovely edge to a work, but I think whether you utilize one or not really depends on the pattern and the effect that you want to achieve. So I think one of the biggest questions that a new knitter will have, I know is one that I often had, still have sometimes, which is, am I experienced enough to work this pattern? Whether it's a lace pattern, stranded color work, entrelac, intarsia, whatever it is, a sweater, whatever it is, you look at a pattern and you think it's really lovely and you're like, but am I ready to knit this? Am I capable? Do I have the skills? And my answer to this is the way that you know is your own willingness to try. Yes, patterns oftentimes will get categorized as a beginner pattern, an intermediate pattern, an advanced pattern, and that is useful information in terms of just knowing some of the construction techniques that might be involved and whether you have acquired those skills or not. But personally, my personal philosophy when it has come to knitting has always been to dive into the deep end, where it's like, if I liked something, if I liked a pattern, I was like, well, I'm not going to learn how to do it if I don't try it. So even if a pattern was advanced and I still considered myself a beginner knitter, I would get the pattern, I would look at it, I would try to work it. If there were skills that were required in it, I would try to learn those skills, sometimes more successfully than others. But I'm really glad that I took that sort of adventurous spirit when it came to trying out knitting techniques and patterns, because I feel like that is how I grew as a knitter. There are no knitting police. There are no knitting referees. Nobody's gonna stand over you and say, you need to do a skills test before you can get that pattern. So if there's something you wanna make, try to make it. If you don't have the skills for it yet, that is an opportunity for you to learn those skills.
You got this.
So there are some very common questions in knitting and my answers to them. And I would love to hear from you down in the comments below. Do you agree with them? Do you not agree with them? Do you have other answers, better answers? I'd love to hear about down in the comments below and have a conversation. Or are there questions that you have that I didn't answer today? Because frankly, I've loved doing this video and I would love to do more videos like this. So please let me know down in the comments below what your questions are about knitting. I hope that you enjoyed today's video, and if so, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with your other knitting friends. Liking videos, sharing videos, commenting on videos are all great ways to let YouTube know that this is a place worth checking out. It shares me with other knitters and it helps me grow this community and channel. If you have not already, please make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Hitting the notification bell will ensure that you get notified whenever I upload a new video or start a live stream. Once again, down in the description box, you will find a list of materials and resources I think are helpful for today's video, and some of these will include clearly marked affiliate links. If you utilize one of my affiliate links to do some shopping, or you leave me a tip through SuperThanks or my Ko-fi, all those commissions and tips do get reinvested back into my channel so I can keep hopefully producing great videos for you to enjoy. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you have a great rest of your day, evening, weekend, weeknight, whenever you may be watching this. And as always, happy health and happy making. Bye. So when you're first learning how to knit, there's some pretty common questions that start to come up. Some of them will come up naturally, like, for example, I wrote one down. Oh, I got stuck deep. Damn it. I have food in my teeth. Oh, that doesn't show. Okay. There's a garbage can right there. I didn't just throw food out of that discrepancy, right? Between what we will knit this, knit this, knit this. We will knit this. By the way, at the end of the video, if you're like, Carrie, I really enjoyed this video, I want more from you, no worries, got you covered. There's gonna be a couple of video suggestions here at the end. You can click on one of the videos and keep enjoying this space. If you gotta run, totally gotta understand it, but down the corner, there's a picture of me. Click on that picture and you can still subscribe to my channel. So that's it. All my plugs are done and my throat is dying. I'm gonna go have some lunch.